Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Revamped Founder. In this episode, we have Kristen, who is the founder of Moonrise, joining us. She is building the future of learning, homeschooling, and the future of education. In this episode, we talk about the importance of homeschooling, what is wrong with the current educational system, and what does the future of schooling look like? How can the modern parents create the next Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, and mm, create the best founders and the people who change the world. That's all from my side. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you.
So, hey Chris, how are you? It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and I hope it will be an incredible episode.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, I want to click this interview of like you built 10 rocket, not 10 rocket, 10 rocket. Then you switched from building apps to revolutionizing the learning or educational industry. So, how did that come about?
Let's see. I've always believed in solving problems that I personally experience. So I started 10 Rocket because, funny enough, I was trying to build an education app as somebody who didn't know how to code. So I had this idea for an app that allowed kids to track their creative portfolio, kind of like a LinkedIn for creativity to replace the transcript, right? So I even at that time, I thought grades were a very poor way to measure learning or progress, and that it seems like what matters in the world is what you've built and what you've done. And it seemed odd that there wasn't really a way for kids to track the things that they've done. And so this idea for giving them prompts for things to do and then track their progress through a portfolio was the idea. Um, and since I didn't know how to code, I started calling people who knew how to code to see what it would take to build it. And I would get quotes usually in the range of 100 to $150,000, and about 6 months of time to build it. And at the time, I was working for a nonprofit, making I think I was making $30,000 a year or something like that. And I was like, man, this kind of sucks. Like, I think I'd be a really good founder, and that this could work, but you know, I I don't have this money, and I don't know anybody on the investment side. So it just felt like there was this big barrier to being a founder. And so I said, okay, well, maybe I'll just learn how to code. So I learned how to code. I went through a coding boot camp, and that was $10,000, which I thought was a lot better than $150,000. And I built a minimum version of this app as like a not very good programmer in 10 days. And then I thought, well, what could really good developers build in 10 days? Like, I bet they could build like a fully functioning app in 10 days if we had the right scoping process. So I pitched that idea to a group of people at a startup event. There was a guy in the crowd who said he'd be my first customer, and went home to my wife and said, can I turn this into a company? She said, yes, just get more clients. And we wound up building 50 apps over 3 years. And then along the way, I had kids. And this is the, kind of long winded answer to your original question. We started looking at, how they were going to learn and how we were going to raise them. So when my son turned preschool age, we started looking around, and it was really bizarre to me that, since that original idea to like build something creative in education, like even with how much things have changed on the internet, like access to information is everywhere, right? Like Duolingo and YouTube and all this stuff. Like I was like, surely schools would be taking full advantage of this and changing. But we walked into some of the best private schools in the city. Some of these would charge, $20,000 a year to send each kid there, and they looked almost exactly the same as what I remembered when I went to school. There was one that we went into. Again, this was, I think this one was $18,000, and there was a group of 6-year-olds spelling cat on a chalkboard. You know, it was just so bizarre to see that coming from the world of tech, and being really deeply troubled by that as somebody who cares a lot about human development and also being a father. So I kind of went through this 6-month process where I said, what would it actually look like to fix this? Because a lot of people have tried to fix it, you know? And so I didn't presume to just think like, oh yeah, my first idea is going to be right, So I came up with this theory that, really school hasn't changed because they have a monopoly on being a space to drop your kids off during the day. So if you're a parent and you need to work, that means you need, unless you're working from home, and even when you're working from home, you need space from them. Like basically you need a place to where they can go learn and make friends during the day, right? But the only place you can do that is a school. And that's really weird, right? Like think about all the places we can work as adults, right? Like, well, you're not an adult yet, but but adults have coffee shops and co-working spaces and hotel lobbies and offices. So there's this like huge variety, but kids only have schools. And you pretty much have to send them there the full day, and you can't send them there part of the day, right? Or none of the days. And so anyway, um, it kind of just came from this authentic need where I said, what would it look like to build a different place for kids to go and learn and make friends during the day? Like if it wasn't a school, like what would it be? And I said it'd probably be called a co-learning space, and it'd be a lot like these co-working spaces like we work. And that was it. So I really fundamentally think that should exist in the world, and if you do that, it builds the foundation for a new education system.
So like we work for
Hmm.
children.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Now, why do you think that an average person does not put so much thought into the child's education and just follows the status quo?
That's a great question. I don't think this is unique to education. I think most people, until they're faced with like a big enough problem, I don't think most people spend a lot of time questioning like the defaults of the world around them. So this is another way of saying most people kind of like take the world for granted and don't really like push against it very much. And so, like whatever the media says, like that's the input, or, whatever the options are for transportation. Like think about how many people just took it for granted that taxis were the way that we would get around outside of your car, right? Or buses, right? Like you just kind of take what society gives you. And most people are like that, because it takes a tremendous amount of energy, and I think also some ingrained uh, rebelliousness to push against those things, right? Um, so education. People say things like, I went through it. I turned out fine. I don't see any better alternatives out there, and I'm not going to build one. And I know how challenging that is. So it's not like they're bad people. It's just it's a really hard problem to solve. And it's shocking to me that Moonrise is the first of this variety of things. Like everybody up until this point seems to have tried to build different types of schools. And even with that, even the most progressive people in education, the people who have taken a stance against the status quo are still building variants of the thing, right? Variants of the thing that already exists. So they're building better taxis instead of Uber, basically.
So yeah, is Moonrise more or less expensive than private school?
So at the moment, it's substantially less expensive than most private schools. So Moonrise today is $250 a month per kid. We are focused on homeschoolers. Homeschoolers tend to not need full-time, by definition, they don't need full-time childcare. So before Moonrise, let's say Moonrise, and this is true for most cities aside from our location, right? Like homeschoolers spend most of their time at home. So by definition, this is a group of people who don't need, like they don't fundamentally need childcare in order to decide to homeschool. Like they have chosen to, most of the time one parent stays home, or maybe increasingly like one parent works from home, right? But they don't need fundamentally in order to decide to homeschool uh, a place for their kids to go and learn, right? Like they don't need the childcare component. In the sense of like it being a need like water, right? They do need it in the sense like that they need companionship and that sort of thing. It's kind of like that level of the need where it's so much of a unfortunate thing that they have to give up when they pull their kids out of school, that when we present this to them and we give their kids a place to learn and make friends outside of home, it's very popular with them. But that's why we're able to do that at the moment for that price point, because the average parent does not need full-time childcare. I said that that's how we are today because we have ambitions to allow for more levels of utilization all the way up to full-time utilization in the future. But right now we're focused on this segment.
And what are these utilizations?
So ultimately, I mean, it's hard to say what the far distant future will look like, but in the near term future, which, for lack of a better word, might be thought of as like my lifetime, there will be I expect there will always be a need for some parents to work full time, not in their house. Like, think that I feel pretty confident in that. So, in that world, if we are trying to help those families, then the only way that we can help those families to exit school, like, so if we start from the default that school is, let's say, bad or wrong on first principles or something like that, if we want those families to choose Moonrise instead of whatever else they're using for their kids' learning and upbringing, then we will need to have the ability to serve full-time utilization, meaning they drop their kids off basically for a full day, 5 days a week. So, we don't want to, on the long tail of Moonrise, we don't want to turn those families away. We want to be able to serve them. So we have a lot of ideas on how to do that. But we're just starting with our biggest customer segment, which is the most underserved, and that's homeschoolers.
Yeah, so related to this point, now we are seeing that people like Elon Musk and Zuckerberg, they are putting more effort into getting people to come into the office. So work from home might become a little less prevalent in the future. So do you think that will cause a meteoric rise to co-learning spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I think the shift towards I think of this as like like the market went to remote work quickly because of COVID. There was rapid experimentation with what that looked like because it was kind of forced, in the same sense that homeschooling was a bit forced on a lot of people, right? And then a pretty large percentage stuck around with homeschooling, and a large percentage stuck around with remote work. And I think in both cases, what we're seeing is a blurring of those poles. So I think what we're saying is that, like, full-time in-office work with a commute is not ideal. And now we're seeing that full-time remote work with no in-person team interaction is not ideal. And what you want is like a flexible in between. Basically, you want coercion-free states. Like, everything comes down to like coercion with me, and I think with like philosophy, right? People don't like being forced to be in a place. So if they feel forced to be only located at home and working from home remotely, or if they feel forced to only be at the office, like, a forced state goes against human nature. But if you have office environments where you have, let's say, like the mandate is to be there 2 or 3 days a week, that still is a little bit of force. But I think generally what you want is kind of like the flexibility to go between those two when it makes sense for you and the team. So I do think that the trend towards hybrid and remote work will definitely increase demand for homeschooling, and thus for Moonrise, right? People want more flexibility in their schedules, and parents are ultimately tied down to school calendars. So, the way that I always give this as an example is, right now my family could just, if we wanted to, could just pick up and go to Rome for a month if we wanted to. Like, but my friends with kids in regular K through 12 schools can't do that. So the desire to do that in a bunch of different ways outside of that example, I think, will increase demand for Moonrise and for homeschooling.
So you have friends which have the kids in K through 12 schools. Why have you not been able to convince them to join Moonrise?
That's a great question. So most of my friends, like, let's put this like into the realm of close friends, right? So quite a few of my close friends don't live near us, and they don't use Moonrise. I can think of 2 friends close by that have kids in regular school. One is in public school and one is in a charter school. So the charter school family does currently need full-time care. Like, they both work in an office. And so homeschooling's not, at least in the sense of where Moonrise is today, since we don't offer a full-time option, that's what's preventing them. The private school family, I mean, frankly, is just a little bit more conventionally minded. So this is a fancy way of saying not all of my friends think in the same way that I do. It's funny. I think a lot of homeschoolers have the experience of not even being able to convince their family that homeschooling is a good thing. You know, So we still have some pushback from most of my family is pretty understanding of all this, but the decision to homeschool, even within my family, with how much I've researched education, it was still kind of met with a little bit of shock and awe when we first decided to do that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So, do you think economic disparities will decrease the use or uh, the use of co-learning spaces such as Moonrise?
So, at least in the US, homeschooling has a pretty broad economic distribution. There are quite a few low income homeschool families. Um, I mean, if you think about this, it kind of makes sense too, even from like a practical perspective, because a lot of homeschool families only have a single income, right? One parent is working, uh, and the other is staying home to homeschool. So the distribution of economics for homeschool families is pretty broad. We at Moonrise have a very broad dispersion of economic situations. So we have families that are pretty low income, and we have families that are really high income. So one of the good things about our price point is that it's popular with both. Like it's still at 250 an accessible price point. And again, if you're homeschooling, the choice is basically like nothing. You know, they're in the house with you all the time. Or if we happen to live near a homeschool co-op, maybe they go there. So a lot of families will do that. You know, maybe they'll go to like a church co-op or something like that. But you know, Moonrise isn't even close to like private school prices around here, at least.
For sure.
So I think your question was beyond Moonrise, though. It's like, you know, will economic, like, will it continue to be that way at scale, right? Like, will
Yeah.
some economic factors change the number, or maybe it's something like, will the number of homeschoolers stay relatively stable because of some economic situation, right?
Yeah.
Um, the most the biggest driver of that will be the idea that there's a need for one parent to keep working, right? Or sorry, for both parents to keep working. So the need for dual income is a blocker, assuming that they're not remote. So remote helps a lot because you can have dual income families that work remotely. So as long as one parent works remotely, then you know something like Moonrise becomes a possibility. So I think that helps a lot. The other thing that I'll say from an economic standpoint is that at least in the U.S., there's a lot of states that are introducing education savings accounts, ESAs. So, you know, in Florida, they just passed this where if you pull your kids out of public school, you get $8,000 per kid back from the state each year to spend however you want. So I believe there are 6 states with near universal education savings accounts right now. The two that are the most flexible, I think, are Arizona and Florida. And in those states, you know, something like Moonrise would be free for those parents, and then they'd have some left over. So that legislation is growing incredibly fast. There's a company called Odyssey, which is venture backed, run by a guy named Joe Connor. And the fact that that is venture backed shows the rate of progress. Like that company is built on a dependency on legislation in some regards, right? So the fact that it's venture backed by Andreessen Horowitz to the extent that it is shows the optimism around ESAs, I think, expanding throughout the US. It wouldn't surprise me at all if we had, you know, 15 states in the next 5 years adopt ESAs.
How long do you think, uh, in a utopian world, let's say that all schooling is replaced by homeschooling?
Interesting question. That is probably a combination of factors. So I'll dive into this a little bit. I think the biggest factor that will ultimately drive uh, homeschooling is a 10x level improvement in learning outcomes. So here's an example of something that I think would be even stronger of an effect towards pushing people to homeschooling than COVID was. There are quite a few companies now that are working on AI tutors effectively. It's pretty well known in education circles that the most effective learning, or I guess education intervention, is one-on-one work with, you know, quote unquote, like a master, right? Like apprenticeships, one-on-one coaching, tutoring. Like there's something called Bloom Sigma that covers this, you know, where you can measure learning outcomes and their efficacy. So most people in education circles know about this, right? And I think a good bit of the public knows just intuitively that like a one-on-one coach is going to be way more effective than a group lecture. So AI is really interesting from this perspective because you can effectively have a one-on-one tutor in your pocket at all times. And that can, since it's run by software, be reduced incredibly. Like that can basically be like almost free over enough time, because of marginal cost being zero for distribution of software. So once we have a digital one-on-one tutor in every kid's pocket in pretty much any subject, it's almost, and I'll say, and something like Moonrise, where they have a different place to go to learn during the day. In my view, it's almost irresponsible, assuming you have the money to send them there and to pay for those things. It's almost irresponsible not to do it because the outcomes are so much better. Like it's drastically better. So when those two things happen, I think you start to see a shift, especially like if those two things plus universal education savings accounts are in every state. I think those are the conditions to where it crosses 50% really quickly. And you know what's funny is I think all three of those things are happening within the next 20 years. Like that's even possibly conservative. But if we're talking about like the majority of states having ESAs and that level of tech for pretty much any subject, I think 20 years is about right. So that's not crazy, right? I'll be less than 60 when that happens. So, you know, like how old's Tesla now? Like Tesla's about 20 years old, I think. So,
Yeah.
you know, most people still don't have Teslas. So, so anyway, that's my answer. I think it's probably something like we'll cross the 50% barrier in the next 20 or 30 years.
So why do you think will government kind of give incentives to children or parents for leaving public school? Why is that?
Oh, that's a complicated question, but I think I have an answer for it. It's a really good question. Like, so why do governments incentivize people to leave public schools, right? Governments are effectively, you know, like we have a representative government here. So, you know, an elected official represents the public. And the public is increasingly demanding these options in these states. So, the states where this is happening are, you know, places like Arizona, West Virginia, Florida. Those are like three just off the top of, you know, Idaho's another one. So these are very pro-freedom states. Like there's pending legislation in Texas too, right? So the population is increasingly disappointed with public education, but their tax dollars, so they're quite a bit of their tax dollars, about $13,000 per kid per year, is spent, and it's even higher. Like Chicago is about 30. Tax dollars are going to funding public education that they are increasingly not wanting to use. And the way that this translates down into the political pipeline is if you don't fix this, I'm not going to vote for you. So elected officials have like skin in the game in the sense that they want to remain in office. And so they are creating policies that help to address those concerns for those parents and those families. That is a well-functioning democracy in the sense that it works that way. Now, from a dollars and cents perspective, what's happening is that they don't get the full amount of their tax dollars back, right? So in Georgia, it's about $13,000 per year. If we were to pass the legislation that's currently on presentation, like on the docket, if you will, we would only get $6,000 per kid back, so a little less than half. So what that means is that I, as a homeschooler, am not using any of my education tax dollars. And the state would only give me $6 back per kid if it passed, meaning that they get to still keep a good bit of the tax dollars to spend on public education, even though I'm not using it.
That's an interesting point. And I don't think public education will vanish completely. That I don't think is possible.
Yeah, I mean, the way that ESAs are going is that, you know, basically like it becomes public funded education, but not public run education. So I mean, I do see a world where in the distant future, like I don't think public education will disappear in my lifetime, to your point, but I can see a future where it just becomes like so hard for the government to do it as effectively as technology. I think a more likely thing that'll happen is maybe Moonrise would see some competition from schools in the sense that they stop the learning aspect of it and they instead say, okay, well, we have these schools with gyms and classrooms, so let's just like outsource the technology learning side of things and we'll just provide the space. I could see that being a world that exists in the future. Um, but it's going to be really hard for like lecture-based public-run education formats to compete with like one-on-one tutors in your pocket. You know, it's already hard for them to compete with YouTube and Khan Academy and that sort of thing. It just they have a kind of forced monopoly on that because they're the only ones that provide space.
Yeah. Now you mentioned we were talking a lot about schools and learning. So what is the difference between education and learning?
Yeah, good question. So I harp on this a lot. I think you and I
Yeah.
even talked about this before the podcast a little bit in kind of the pre-prep notes. But I tend to think the simplest explanation is education is a thing that's done to you, and learning is an internal thing that you as a human being do. It is a default state of being a human, meaning that it is impossible for a human not to learn. Um, like humans are effectively learning machines in the sense that we have a creative brain that we don't know how to replicate in anything artificial, right? So we know how to recreate biology and biological processes in a lab, but we don't know how to recreate the human mind, namely like the creative engine that causes learning to happen. We don't know how to create that. Even artificial intelligence is not doing this today. It's doing a really fancy, version of pattern recognition, which doesn't do it justice. It's quite amazing technology, but it's not the human mind. Not even close to AGI yet or anything like that. Okay, so that's the simplest definition. Um, I guess that answers your question, right?
Yeah.
Like learning at a fundamental level, like is a process of guesses and based you might think of it as like shots on goal, right? Like I'm going to try X, right? Or I think X. And then you get feedback from sensory observations, right? So it's like there's a theory and then you test that theory with something, usually observation through your senses, and then you get data back, like information back. So you open your eyes, there's an inborn theory, you see that uh, that crying causes milk to arrive in your mouth, and that theory is then reinforced, right? Until it's not anymore, right? And this happens in a number of different ways, right? It's basically like theory, feedback, and then new theory and feedback, and there's a test in between those two. So that's kind of how learning works. It's not how education works, though.
No, I asked the same question to you. I asked this to Michael too, actually. So what we see in learning, and especially he is in Socratic learning, so it means question everything.
Hmm.
There's a very popular chart which shows how much you know, how much you don't know,
Hmm.
how much you don't know that you don't even know. So there's structure is missing in learning. There's no specified structure that you have to learn this. Whereas in education or the schooling system, public schooling system or private school system, they teach uniformly whatever they think has to be taught, but neither of these are like part of the what you don't even know chart part. So how do you think can we battle that? Because after seeing that chart, I am super paranoid that I know this, but what if I don't know what really behind the main thing behind it?
um, okay, these are great questions. Okay, so I'm going to say something to answer this that is going to sound bad, but is actually very good. Uh, the amount that you don't know, the number of things that you don't know, will always be infinite, right? Like there will always be infinitely more that you don't know than you do know, right? That sounds bad, right?
Yeah.
There's no such thing as knowing everything to be known ever, like all information, that sort of thing, right? Uh, the good news is that there's no limit to what you can know. right? Like aside, like the theory of things that are known are explanations about the world and the universe around us, right? So even things that you think you quote unquote know are just the best theories that we have today. But there are so many unsolved problems in the universe, like how to, I mean, even the ones that are within the scope of what we know today, like how to create digital intelligence, right? Like once you figure that out, there are a whole bunch of new problems that come from that that you didn't have before, right? Like humans have never had the problem of like once we have digital intelligence, how do we expand digital intelligence throughout the universe, right? Like we've never had that problem. You don't even know to think about that problem, right? Like there are infinitely more problems on the other side of a given problem that's solved, right? So every new problem creates more problems than the original one, right? So there's always infinitely more of those, right? But that doesn't stop you from wanting to know things to help you solve problems in the real world today, right? Like one of the problems with school is that it teaches you to like think of learning as like information collection in case you'll ever need it. And the real world doesn't work that way at all. The real world is like here's a real thing, right? Like I have not expanded Moonrise to the world yet, right? Like I want there, if I had a magic button that I could press, there would be 10,000 Moonrise locations all over the world, and all of it would operate beautifully, and it would fully replace the education system. And it would be an exact version of my vision, but hopefully including things that I haven't even figured out or thought about yet, right? Like that is a really meaningful problem that I am actively working on solving. And in order to solve it, I have to learn a whole bunch of things, like a whole bunch of things that I don't know today. There's like 20,000 problems that I have to solve for that to happen, and that button would just presumably solve all of them, right? Um, so there is context for me to learn those things because I am really deeply interested in solving that problem. Um, but I don't have the same desire to learn about how underground plumbing works, you know? And I don't care to really have that desire for like intricate details about cellular structure or the periodic table of elements. Like those problems don't have meaningful context in my life today. But if I ever want to, like if I ever want to do something in chemistry, let's say I get really interested in life extension, right? Then I'm going to start caring a lot about cellular structure, and the information is there for me to work on those problems, but the thing that's actually going to cause that is the deep interest in solving that problem, right? And school just assumes that you care about these problems, and they don't give you the context for why you should care about those problems, right? So I think most of the job of anything in education is to create and help people find meaningful problems to work on, and then the information is there. Like you need to provide the motivation and the space and the information, and the rest, with guidance kind of takes care of itself.
Yeah, now you're deeply interested in physics. I saw
Yes.
that a
Yes.
tweet from you.
Yeah, I suppose I am.
Yep, same here. Let's take for example physics. Anything like Newton's laws. Now, when you are in school, they know that where to start from to teach it to you well or not well. That depends. But when you're learning by itself, how do you or where to start? That's the
Mm,
biggest problem.
yeah. Yeah. So I don't think there's a single answer to that. Like, I think part of the learning process is a search process. Like, there's no one answer to like how to start physics, right? It's kind of like it really depends on the individual and what they're interested in, right? Like, so different physics problems have different things. I mean, you might say that it starts literally with a search, right? Like, uh, I don't know the information I need, but I'm going to put some things out there into the world to try to find it. So maybe it's like a chat GPT prompt, or it's a query on Google, or it's a email to a mentor, or it's a request from a parent. But your search, it's a search for answers, right? Um, like it's not a textbook. It's not a single YouTube video. It's not a class. Like it's a search. And there's no authority source on information that can say always start here, which is what school kind of attempts to do, right? It's like an averaging effect where it's saying, hey, given a broad interest in physics, maybe start with Newton's laws or something like that. But it's totally provided outside of context, and it tries to provide context with grades, right? Like, here's why you should care about this problem, because if you don't care about this problem, you're going to fail. So what that causes is a correct response where that information is learned very temporarily, such that you can pass the class, and then it's immediately forgotten once your problem is solved, right? So the whole edifice of school is basically like solving the short-term problem of getting grades so that you can then move on to the next problem of getting grades in the next thing.
What do you think can we use to test the knowledge? Because exams are not considered a good thing these days. So what do you think we can use instead of exams?
So one of the most helpful, I guess, mental models that I have for learning is to not consider there to be a fundamental difference in human beings. I think this is an error that we make, similar to the error that we made by thinking that people of different skin colors uh, have different states of being a human, right? So one of the errors is considering kids a different type of human, right? So the reason I bring this up is you and I don't. Well, I guess you're still in school. When you become an adult, there's no such thing as testing your knowledge. Like, there's no structure of testing new things that you've learned other than the things that you're able to build and do in reality. So it's more a question of agency. Like, what does the knowledge gives you power, right? Over yourself, over your circumstances, as human beings, kind of increasingly over nature and our surroundings. And so to me, the test of knowledge is the growth of agency, which is another way of saying like things that you're capable of doing. If somebody is learning piano, what you would like to see is an advancement in the things that they're able to play on that instrument. Uh, if somebody is starting a company, you'd like to see them advance in the complexity and, I guess, alignment with personal interests of the companies that they're able to start. Other than that, you're really testing memory, right? So most grades are testing short-term memory. And when you take a college exam, most of the time they're not testing the things that you've learned in fifth grade, right? Um, so so that's why I mean it's mostly about short-term memory. You do have a stacking of memory, right? So there are things where memory builds upon itself, and there's kind of lower branches of things that you have to remember. But all the things that are worth remembering are things that have context in your life. So most people, like, once you learn how to drive, you drive a lot. It's an important thing to learn. If you took a test about driving and then suddenly had to drive, 10 years later, nobody would know how to drive. So that's kind of a long-winded way of answering your question, but I think it's, what are you trying to do, like, that matters, um, for measuring learning. And then in that case, most of the time it's quite obvious whether or not you can do those things to some degree of mastery.
So you mentioned a part about that tests or exams don't really matter in adult life, but there's a misconception or thinking that school prepares children for adult life by putting the almost equivalent amount of pressure on them, which they can handle when they get into the workforce or leave school. Actually, what do you think? Is that true, or what are your thoughts on that?
So I think this is similar to the question of people liking that school is not an ideal, like, it's an admission that school is not an ideal environment. And this is kind of like the life is tough argument, right?
Yeah,
Like, life is tough, school is tough, therefore school prepares you for tough times. Is that right?
yeah.
Um, if that's what you're saying, then you know reality is accessible as long as we take kids out of school, right? So there are plenty of ways to engage in reality that are not putting people through artificial coercive environments. In the sense that school is a forced environment that is not enjoyable, and that is hard. uh, that is a very foreign thing for most adults. Like most adults do not have forced environments that where they are subjected against their will to a battery of tests and bullies and that sort of thing, right? A lot of people. So there are probably people who would argue with this by saying that jobs are like that. But people leave jobs all the time. Um, and it doesn't mean that the next one that they go to is going to be perfect, but people have freedom to leave jobs. Now, they have less freedom to fully exit the job market, but in that case, they have the freedom to gain new knowledge, which helps them to advance up the level and eventually, maybe start their own thing or find a better position that they like, right? So it's not the same kind of force, right? It's an economic force, and even that, like most people, then you get into arguments like, well, things used to be better, like we should all just live off the land. Freedom affords the ability for all of us to do that now. So people that complain about, how things used to be so much better when we were in the agrarian age, those people have the freedom to get off their iPhones, to sell their cars and go live off the land. They don't do that because they like what we have now better, right? So this idea that like we're forced into the modern economy, I think is false too, right? We all like having these things and we choose to work so that we can afford the things that society provides us.
Yeah, that's an incredible point. Like this, a lot of people believe this narrative. A lot of parents actually, but yeah, incredible. So what do you think was different from the education or learning that happened in the primitive era that can be applied to how we learn today?
Primitive era, like pre-enlightenment or caveman or something like that.
Uh, I think before the industrial revolution.
Okay, so pre-enlightenment.
Yeah,
Um, so pre-enlightenment, there were still like I guess we had more of a trade-based um, educational structure. Most people learned by doing. Um, it was forced in a in a different sense, in the sense that like if your parents were farmers, you were likely to be a farmer, and it was very hard to advance past that just because you weren't exposed to the sorts of people and opportunities to get past that. There really was a limitation on knowledge back then because we didn't have the internet, right? And even from a sense of books, like one of the reasons why the major industrialists like Carnegie were so important. They built libraries, and that was really important because that was the main way of accessing knowledge, right? So, I'm not suggesting that we should go back to this for those reasons on their own merits. I guess the thing that we can learn is that it was much more about learning by doing. So, a lot of the smartest people and most successful people in history were apprentices at a very young age. So, I think Carnegie sold papers, if I remember correctly, when he was 14. Steve Jobs, even in modern times, was like emailing the founder of HP at a young
yeah,
age, asking about computer parts. Um, Giving young children agency and challenge at a young age, I think, is something that we can definitely learn. We have more of a coddling society now, where we artificially constrain their environments and then kind of drop them into the real world. When they turn 22, usually it's after college now. So I think that's one of the reasons, other than outside of the realm of founders, I think that's one of the reasons why you see fewer young people doing remarkable things. If you go back and look at how the age of some of these people that signed the Declaration of Independence, they were very young relative to what you would imagine most politicians are today that make major legislative changes. Um, and I think that's part of it. They just had to, do harder things at a younger age. So that would be my contribution, is helping, children have more agency by doing things that are hard. Uh, Another way of saying that is allowing them to work. Like, child labor laws were built around a time where we still had, machines and factories that were very dangerous. If you think about knowledge work, there's no danger, inherent in doing knowledge work at a young age. So kids should be programming and designing and, making YouTube videos and that sort of thing. It's a great way to gain agency right now.
yeah. So how should we actually teach children to face hardships? Because if everything is accessible, then they get used to the cushy life or something like that. How do you create an environment like that?
How do you create an environment that gets children used to hardship?
Yeah,
I don't I don't think I would start the question there. And it's not a bad question. I just so like I think that starts from the premise that different types of environments need to be specifically designed for that purpose for children. Um, First of all, I disagree that with the idea that all adults, by dint of the structure of society, have to face constant hardship. Like I think if you look at this point in history, even though people complain a lot, there is less human suffering and hardship than at any time prior. So, you know, hardship itself is a moving target. So this goes into the same idea of having a societal construct of what's important to teach children. Like society moves when we make progress, and it's moving at an accelerated pace because technology is pushing progress ever faster. So if you were to design something to force children into a situation where they had to deal with hardship, um, by the time they got out, the definition of hardship may have moved, or it may be that fewer people hopefully have to go through hardship. So I think there's also an important point here too about the difference between suffering and hardship and challenge. So you do want environments that are very challenging, um, but reality is challenging, and kind of the fundamental, I guess, dividing line between school and reality is the need to create value, right? So people have this impression that kids can't create value until they reach a certain age, and now all of a sudden they can. And I just fundamentally disagree with that. So I think introducing ways for kids to create value at a young age will therefore create the sort of challenges that we adults have to face. And maybe at that age they're doing things that are less desirable for creating value than they will be 20 years later. But that's what adults face when we graduate. Most people start off in a job or a profession that we don't like as much, and we're in a battle to get towards something where we create value and we really like it.
Yep. So hardship is or challenges. It is a relative term.
Relative, and I don't think forcing people into bad environments is a good thing. Like I don't think we should force hardship because of some false idea that that's going to prepare them. Like the real world has challenges. Like what you want are meaningful problems. You don't want forced hardship. Like that's a bit like slavery, right?
Yeah.
Um, it's different than slavery in the sense that there's an end goal where there's an exit out of it, right? But at least while they're in that situation, that would be like saying slavery is justified because when they get out of it, then they'll have been used to hardship and therefore better citizens or something like that. Like nobody would ever justify that for adults.
So why is that? Like, why do you think that some children have more drive than others?
I mean, the shortest and most direct answer is that humans are different and we have different interests. Um, Even when you watch a television show, you are solving problems. Like you're modeling the problems of the characters uh, in that show, and you are using the creative capacity of your brain to create that problem in your own mind. And it wouldn't be an interesting show. Like imagine just watching a video of a paperclip standing still. That would be a really boring show because you don't have any problems to solve. Right? It's just sitting there, so it's not interesting. Um, I tend to think what's happening when people think of drive is they assign drive to things that like we all kind of collectively agree are important and move society forward. So, somebody may be really driven to watch YouTube videos all day, and somebody may be really driven to solve quantum physics in some meaningful way to push, maybe quantum computation forward, right? And we tend to assign societal importance to the latter because it has a positive impact for the rest of us, whereas watching YouTube videos does not typically. Although Mr. Beast would be an interesting counterpoint, where he started off, watching and getting obsessive about YouTube videos, and kind of became this prolific creator, right? So that would not have looked to anyone other than Mr. Beast like he was doing something really productive and creative. But obviously, we know now that he was. I think people are driven to solve meaningful problems. I think that's universal. The definition of what problems they find meaningful is based on interest, and that's very different and highly variant between people.
Now you mentioned the part about quantum physics. So I think one question came to my mind. Do you think geniuses exist? Because like we saw, for example, Einstein or Newton. Do you think they were genius, if that's even a thing, or were they just, like you mentioned, driven to solve a problem?
I think they were driven to solve a problem. They got so interested in that they became obsessed with it. And when you become obsessed with something, you over enough time find limitations to what's already known. Because if it was already known, there wouldn't be a problem, right? So they became obsessed with the disparity or the discrepancy between what was known about physics and some observation that they were making, some theory that they had, right? And it's kind of like a mystery, right? It's almost identical to a mystery, like reading a novel. There was a gap in the knowledge there where they had a theory that contradicted with whatever the mainstream was, and there was no knowledge between those two things that was sufficient to solve that mystery. So they had the interest to learn the things that they needed to learn to solve that problem, and they did have the creative capacity to solve it. So if there is a genius level there somewhere, it's that they had the creative capacity to overcome the lack of knowledge and create that knowledge in the world. Now, this then gets into questions of, was there something inherent in Einstein that allowed Einstein to creatively solve that lack of knowledge that somebody else would not have been able to? And I personally don't think that there is, because that would require some specific definition of genius that we don't have. So to me, it's a bad explanation. Like if genius were quantifiable, it's a bit like what's happening in AI right now. Everybody is saying, oh, AI is eventually going to be, human level intelligent. And then if you ask them how or why, right, there's no good theories there. It's some kind of like a slippery slope argument, like, oh, this is getting better over time, and therefore like it'll eventually replace humans. But that's not a good explanation, right? Otherwise, we would be able to do it now, right? So something will happen along the way where we have a theory, and that theory creates AGI, right? And I think that's how people think of genius or IQ, is that there's just something that crosses the chasm that Einstein had and others didn't, but nobody is specific about what that is. Like, is it some kind of like a gene? It doesn't seem to be.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's a guy, Steve HSU, however you pronounce his last name. I think it's Shu, that has some interesting ideas about genius, where it gets a little bit into the genes. I personally don't agree with it, but I do think his points are kind of interesting. I can't articulate them perfectly here, but he does a good interview with, I think it was Dwarmesh, who runs the Lunar Society podcast.
Yeah.
Anyway, he has some interesting theories about genius, but yeah, I don't personally subscribe to it. I think every human is inherently capable of solving interesting problems with enough obsession.
Yeah, that's what do you think differentiates how the so-called geniuses learn and the rest of the society learns?
I think the primary distinction is that they pick different problems to solve. Look at collector. Paul Graham has a really good essay about collectors. People who collect stamps are just as obsessed with collecting stamps as I am about fixing the education system. But at the other end of that obsession, they're just going to have a lot of stamps in their house. So what's the difference? Like, they're really interested in stamps and I'm really interested in freeing children. If you had them on your podcast to talk about stamps, they would tell you a bunch of things you've never even considered about stamps, and it would be super interesting. But then you would both walk away from that, and society would be none the richer, other than the momentary interest in that, right? But what I would hope is that if some human being 30 years from now, if I died today, if some human being 10 years from now, whatever, listens to this podcast, I would say and they're interested in education and fixing it and freeing children. I would hope that some of these ideas that I share, after thinking about it a lot, would help them to advance the cause themselves, right? I'm hoping that I'm creating new knowledge that helps push us forward in that way, even if my specific company doesn't end up being the one that solves it.
Now you mentioned the part about that Moonrise cannot be the only one. So do you think that, we know that will be a commutative effort from a lot of different organizations, Do you think a certain global organization like the United Nations, not exactly, but which controls or regulates all the education in all the 193 countries,
Mhm.
do you think something like that should exist?
Uh, no, that's pretty close to the opposite of what I think should exist. Uh, so, you know, having centralized control over lots of countries and therefore billions of people is a recipe for disaster. Um, it's it's not even like authoritarianism. It is authoritarianism. Uh, so if you think about what's happening there, that is just about equivalent to mind control, except for human beings are creative, right? So what's happening is you have a centralized body of bureaucrats with no skin in the game for these decisions. Presumably, they can all exit their own education systems, so their own children aren't even being subjected to these things. And then they are deciding the things that people should learn. They are deciding how people should learn, the environments they should learn in, and what constitutes the idea that they've learned those things. So, I mean, don't get me wrong, that is happening. Like today, that's happening. That's what's happening in the United States with public education. You have centralization of bureaucrats. Now, we do allow it at the state level to some degree. So there is a little bit more localism, but everybody kind of plays by the same rules. Where we have public education, there's a set of bureaucrats that decides what people should learn and what the environment should be. And then they decide, what constitutes the idea that learning has happened. So homeschooling, if you think about what it is the exact opposite of that. It puts
Yeah.
control into the hands of families. Unschooling takes that even further. So I think unschooling, at least philosophically, is the most aligned with what I'm saying because unschooling puts that control in the mind of the individual. Even homeschooling, which I'm very much in favor of, uh, still has a bit of authoritarianism as a parent, right? Where the parent is deciding what goes into the mind of the child and um, what their environment is and that sort of thing. But that is much more localized than anything involving a school or a set of bureaucrats.
Yep. So now you mentioned the part about homeschooling, which uh, gives a lot of authority to the parents. But then wouldn't the learning be limited to the knowledge of the parents, or there will be no new space to foster new ideas at home?
So parents are not usually the source of information. Any form of schooling is typically not the source of the information. So schools don't create the knowledge that they quote unquote transmit to kids. That's not how it works, but that's how they think it works, right? Um, so schools are big buildings typically, or not always. So let's say that there's for this conversation or this part of the conversation, let's say there's no difference between charter, public, private schools, and the schools are just buildings with a curriculum. That curriculum is built on existing knowledge that they curate and transmit and hold people accountable for. So parents are the same way. Like parents are not creating the information. I didn't create, basic geometry uh, or anything like that, right? So what I'm doing is I'm finding information, I'm curating it, and I think what you're getting at is that there is some activity involved with taking that information and bundling it in such a way that hopefully it sticks with our kids, right? Now, then the question is, if you believe that, who is more likely to be able to get that information to stick? And not only that, even if you believe that parents are bad about that, do you believe that they shouldn't be allowed to try, right? Because there's plenty of countries that disallow or make illegal homeschooling for this reason. They're so convinced of the ability of teachers to be able to transmit this knowledge meaningfully that they forbid parents from doing it, right? Um, so, in cases like this where it's potentially up for debate, then what most people do when they're being earnest is they look at the data. And the data around homeschooling is much better. It's the most effective learning outcome as far as schooling measures are concerned. They perform better than charter, public, and private schools. Um, so now, then you could say, what about a bad homeschool parent, right? But then, by that same definition, you should not allow bad schools to exist. And there are plenty of bad schools that have much more moral problems than bad homeschoolers, right? Um, so all these things fall apart by comparison. Like if you shouldn't be allowed to homeschool because some parents are bad at teaching, then you shouldn't allow bad schools to exist, and you certainly shouldn't fund them millions of dollars, right? Which is what's happening.
Yep. So we relate to this topic actually with Michael. We talked about that government should completely be removed from being a part of education. So do you think the like Joe Biden's line that these are our children, our kids? So do you think that is correct?
Um, Listen, I'm a libertarian philosophically, but not politically. Like a lot of people in my circle are very much like tried and true libertarians, borderline anarchist, right? And I tend to think that the United States, as far as countries go, mostly does a good job at the institutional level. Like institutional government is insanely hard, and it should like people think it should move at the speed of startups. That's not the job of an institution. Like institutions should be a little bit conservative because they have so much impact over so many people. So, people get frustrated at the speed at which governments move. And in some degrees, like infrastructure, where there's more known problems, like that should be much faster, right? Major decisions about how kids learn should not be taken lightly, right? So all the things that I'm saying about Moonrise and learning, like I'm not suggesting that the government should just adopt all of Moonrise's ideas, like kill the public education system and fund Moonrise instead, right? What I do advocate for are things like ESAs, where they put that they give those taxpayer dollars back to the parents, right? With some restrictions, namely that they need to be used for educational purposes. If you ask me my political opinion today, I'm not so much an anarchist or a pure libertarian that I think they shouldn't take our tax dollars at all, and instead they should just let us spend it however they want. I do think that there's some institutional importance for making sure that the population is you know, taking care of our kids and, helping them learn and that sort of thing. It's just that the way that we're doing it is very backwards, but I'm very encouraged by ESAs existing. So I think like the summary of that answer is that I'm okay with tax dollars being advocated for learning purposes as long as parents have say in those tax dollars. Otherwise it's theft, right? Um, we're taking this and we're going to fund this thing that you don't like, right? If you give them some level of control over those tax dollars, then I think that's fine. I could end up beating my words about that. I might change my mind about that, with a smart argument from somebody. But at least right now, that's my stance.
I think Isaac Asimov, I think his name is, I don't remember it
Yeah.
correctly. He has some incredible ideas, or what he said in accordance with his time about education. A lot of people can't think of that today, actually. He has some incredible books, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I know he wrote Foundation, right?
Yeah.
I haven't actually read any of his books. A lot of people in kind of the startup circle have read a lot of Isaac Asimov. I just haven't. What ideas do you like of his? Do you remember any specifically from like? Do any come to mind?
I've, so it was written, I think, in the 20th century, something like that. I don't remember the time period, but he talked about robotic learning at that time.
Oh, cool.
So that was kind of interesting. But I personally not read a lot of books too.
Mm.
But I think that I should have read them.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few people who were very prescient about where society is moving. Once we had computers, a lot of people started putting the pieces together. Uh,
Yeah,
Seymour Papert, I think, wrote Mindstorms. I think that's his name. He kind of put the pieces together. Um, Maria Montessori, she was very, very
yeah,
smart. She got a lot of things right. Um, most of my deepest philosophical underpinnings about the ideas around children and meaningful work like are certainly inspired by some of her teachings. Yeah. There's a guy named Ivan Illich who wrote about this, I believe, in the 70s, like deschooling society. Pink
Yeah.
Floyd, their most famous song uh, is about the factory schooling system.
Yeah.
So, this was all very interesting to me starting Moonrise because people have been saying this for decades upon decades, and it's gotten worse, not better. Whereas most things in society have gotten better. So that was a big part of the intrigue around solving this problem.
Now I want to ask a question about. It just came to my mind related to philosophers.
Mm-hmm.
So I was talking to a person. I remember the other day we were talking about Socrates. He told me that don't mention Socrates ever to me. I said why? He said because he just thinks and speaks what he thinks, but he has not actually done a lot of things.
Mm.
Uh, like he has not done anything practically. So why should we listen to the guy? I thought it was an interesting point. I said I'd
Hmm.
get back to you. What do you
That
think
is an
about that?
interesting point. I haven't heard that before. I would argue that at the time of Socrates, he served a very important role.
Yeah,
Um, his culture was enlightenment before the Enlightenment, and we didn't have the internet, and there was a premium on clear thinking, which you might call philosophy. And his ideas were translated. Like his ideas were written down and I mean transmitted. Like people were familiar with his ideas. Um, so I would argue that he did do something in the sense that he formalized his thinking at a time when thinking was very important, and that his work was to transmit ideas pre-enlightenment and pre-internet. Um, it's a bit like essayists, right? Like there are very smart people who write really good books. One of my favorite thinkers today is David Deutsch. Now, David Deutsch does do things in the world of physics, but those things don't have much practical meaning in my daily life. But his book, The Beginning of Infinity, fundamentally changed my worldview. Um, so as long as these people are communicating their ideas, like Paul Graham is very similar. Like he did a lot. He started a company called ViaWeb and then started Y Combinator. But to me, his most practical invention is his essays. That's
yeah.
the thing that's had the most impact on my life. So I think writing down new ideas is very important as a function. And it doesn't have to be translated into acting on those ideas because at that level, the creation is in the essay and in the knowledge creation.
Yes, related to this actually. Now we're talking about ideas getting passed down from generation to generation.
Hmm.
So what school actually does is it teaches it in a uniform manner so that each child gets to know the bare minimum that there is required to know. But do you think that if a person learns by himself, then how they receive the knowledge and how they transmit it actually, it would be different or it could be different how the rest of the society does. Do you think that can be a problem?
No, because I think variance is a very good thing for progress. Um, Anytime you have standardization and homogenization across something like human minds, but not just human minds, like anything, um, it's anti-progressive. Like, so as far as we know, there's two things that are capable of making progress in the universe. Like, there's natural selection, so basically like biological evolution, and there's human minds, right? Like, those are the two. And we're trying to make digital intelligence, but effectively, when those work, that'll work like human minds as well, right? Um, so one of the mechanisms that cause that to work in both cases, it is a variant, like something is conjectured, like a new idea, a new theory, a new species, a new butterfly wing or color on the butterfly wing, something like that, right? Uh, and then it is criticized by being put into the world. So that butterfly is normally red. Now it has a blue wing. This human, this human mind, like wasn't aware of something called a computer, and it writes down the idea of a computer, right? And then those things are either discarded or selected, right? So people like and work on the idea of a computer, or that butterfly lives instead of dies and passes on its genes, right? Um, that is the engine of progress in both cases, right? So if you, I think your question was about like variant, like is variance in human minds because of like different learning environments a bad thing? I think it's a very good
Yes.
thing. The more variance you have, the more uh, shots on goal you have for selection, right? And then as long as we have good information spreading mechanisms, which we do through the internet and through just human culture, then you have more opportunities for those things to be selected and transmitted through the rest of the species.
So related to this thing, when a teacher teaches the student, let's say he's a teacher with a very modern mind, does not follow the book. So does he tell the student what he understood of the topic, or what the student should know to develop his or her understanding?
I think it can be both. So quite often what you find when you're trying to like teachers are explaining things, right? Like there's no magic sauce. Like they're explaining knowledge and they're trying to help however their explanation is designed. Like a good teacher is better at explaining things, right? Sometimes you find that the way of explaining things that make sense to you does not work for explaining things to the people you're teaching, right? So this is no different than like how you and I like act in daily life, right? Like we're doing a little bit of it now, right? Where we're trying to like share ideas and help them land in each other's mind in the right way. So you'll phrase a question in a certain way, and then I'm like, "Is it this?" And you're like, "No, it's this." And I'm like, "Okay, I get it now." So I think the minds of children are not, or the minds of any human are not identical to the minds of the person sharing information with them. So what you're trying to do is gain a common ground at what kind of things are meaningful and contextual to them. If you're doing it right, some people just don't care. They're like, here, you're going to fail if you don't learn it this way. So you better figure out chemistry, right? But the good people are like, okay, like let's say it's math, very basic math. So I'm teaching my 4-year-old daughter very basic math right now. She has fingers and we have Cheerios in the house. And so, a good way to teach her math is not to force her to look at these numbers on a piece of paper that have no meaning to her. And she can't take those with her everywhere. But she quite often has Cheerios close by or goldfish crackers, and she has fingers with her at all times. And so, anytime where she ever encounters counting, she can use her fingers, right? And she has plenty of times in real life where she's going to want to count, right? And now she has this little tool that exists on her hand that she can use to do it, right? I never use my fingers for counting because I know how to not need that now. So
Yeah.
that problem's not meaningful to me. But to her, it matters a lot. So good teaching is really just grounding the explanation in context for her to where she can use it.
Yep. That's an incredible point. I like the Cheerios example. Like that. That's good.
Oh, thanks.
So because in school we are at a very young age when you're thrown out by numbers, like symbols, not even numbers, which you don't understand. That is a challenge in itself.
Yeah, you can tell. I don't know if you followed, how teaching is changing in the United States, but typically, like things pervade from the United States and they start spreading out through other cultures as well. So maybe you've seen this as well. But we have this thing called Common Core here, where the methodology of teaching changed towards like I think a well-intentioned goal, which is critical thinking, right? So the way that math is taught, they're trying to help with an understanding, like a deep understanding of numbers. But what ends up happening is that you end up with more of a numbers on paper situation instead of a counting on fingers situation. And you end up with a lot of frustration, so much so that like there are always like posts on Twitter of math homework that kids are getting where the adults don't know how to solve it. It's like I don't even know what this means, right? And that stands in the way of the goal there, which is to help them gain agency in the world, right? Most people don't need to understand the mechanics of like exactly what it means to do like 40 divided by 10 or something like that, right? Like you can take it to a very basic understanding where you can say like you're taking a larger thing and you're putting it into equal piles, right? Like that's about the level of understanding you need. And then from that point, it's how can I help you actually do that as quickly as possible? The answer is a calculator, by the way. But schools are very against
Yeah.
using the best tools at our disposal. So anyway, yeah, I think schools are just like most things, they're trying to continue their own existence instead of help people learn.
Do you think there will be a time when the old generation, so about after a century or something, when the woke people take over, they will the education or the public schooling system will stagnate.
Yes. Um, I mean, I'm very optimistic, like in my bones, but optimistic not in the idealistic sense, but
Yeah.
in the sense that as long as we protect our engines of progress, that we will continue to make progress. And I believe that the public school premise is inherently flawed and very damaging. And if we continue to make progress, then those flaws will eventually be sorted out and resolved. Um, that's the most philosophical reason. I mean, practically, you're seeing this today. It's just increasingly not working for people. And, that's from a schedule perspective, it's from a wellness perspective, it's from a learning perspective, it's from a safety perspective. So asking if, there would have to be some fundamental change, which is totally possible. It could be that public education just radically changes to be more in line with Enlightenment culture. But the problem with that is, by definition, the idea of a school is a curriculum bundled with a physical space, right? And that's where I think it just won't happen that way, to where they'll just change, because it would not be a school anymore. Like, if it changes, it just wouldn't be a school anymore, because you shouldn't bundle a curriculum in with that thing, because it implies that the things that they should learn, and that they agree with those things from the outset, and that everybody should learn in this specific way, right? So when I say it's wrong on first principles, that's why. You're not going to have alignment of interest and skills and that sort of thing, such that it justifies a curriculum. The time when a curriculum makes sense is when everybody agrees to the end goal and wants to be there voluntarily. So Bloom Institute of Technology, which was formerly Lambda School, has a very good reason to have a curriculum, because their students want to be there to get a coding job. So they're coming in as non-coders. They want to exit as paid software engineers, right? So they are very highly motivated to learn the material, and they're there voluntarily. Bloom Tech, formerly Lambda School, does not make money unless they get a job, right? So their whole business model is built on helping their students achieve the reason why they're there, which is to get a coding job. That is a very high functioning, in theory at least. It's very challenging to run that, but it's a very principled approach to how a curriculum should work. But again, it's a very specific domain skill. So learning how to code and not just learning how to code, getting a job in coding, that is a very tight, specific thing that justifies a curriculum. Kids don't have an idea of what they want to do when they're older. They have a general idea, but most people change what they want to do. Schools don't help them accomplish it. There's no specific outcome designed for that purpose. Learning is very general purpose, and you have 4 points of conflicting interest, which is the institution, the school itself, the teacher, actually more than 4, the teacher, the student, and the parent, right? And most of the time they all have conflicting goals. So it just wrecks the idea of having a curriculum.
I think we touched upon the curriculum part in the last round too, a
Yeah.
little bit. So, what do you think? Uh, how do you actually create a curriculum in a homeschool?
So I am generally of the approach that we don't want to create a curriculum in homeschool. Again, a lot of this depends on what you mean. A lot of people, when they say curriculum, they mean pedagogy. So a curriculum is a set of learning interventions that is fixed and that you put kids through, usually against their will. And again, Lambda School has a curriculum. It is not against their will. So it is, in that case, just a set of learning interventions that are, this is probably a better definition. So instead of against their will, it's designed to achieve an outcome. So here's a set of learning interventions designed to achieve an outcome, right? I think the best version of homeschooling is finding out what the kids are interested in and what they want to do, and then using the best tools at your disposal to help them do the things that they want to do. Now, some of those things that they want to do are not always expressed, and this gets into child rights, right? Like, it may not be obvious to the child that they want to overcome the struggle to learn how to read. And so people who differ on opinions of homeschooling versus unschooling, this is where they usually get held up. And this actually applies more broadly for education in general. Like, should there be a situation where, the teacher or the school or the parent, like, forces a child against their will to learn something, right? So a true unschooler, like a really true, totally principled unschooler, will not even, put their kids through the process of learning how to read or do basic math, because they are waiting for the problem set to arise, for that problem to become worth the challenge of learning to do it, right? So a truly principled unschooler will do that, and unschoolers have very good learning outcomes. My kids, I was able to overcome the problem by explaining to them why they want to learn how to read. So that's like, I still followed the unschooling approach. It just took a lot of convincing and time to explain this in such a way that they wanted to learn how to read. I tend to think that that's the best approach because I'm anti-coercion in any sense, but it was very important to me to try to convince them to do that, because the sooner they can read, the sooner they can work on and start solving more problems in reality. So anyway, your original question was like, how does curriculum, how do you design a homeschool curriculum? My answer is that you should try to find out what your kids want to do and find the best tools to help them get there. So just depends on their age and their interests, I suppose, like, and their skill level.
Yep. Actually, I was just looking up the teacher to student ratio. Sorry, the student to teacher ratio. So in US, it's actually 15:1 average. Do you
Yeah.
think that is good, or like it is worse than homeschooling, but relatively? Do you think 15 students for one teacher for 15 students is a good thing?
I mean, like so many of my answers here, like, there's kind of deeper underpinnings to answer that question. 15:1 for a lecture, there's not much wrong with it. It's definitely less effective than 1-to-1. So if you're just, if all things are equal and the same information is being communicated in the exact same way, it's better for that to be 1-to-1 than 1-to-15. And it's better to be 1-to-15 than 1-to-30, because when you present information, it's not going to land in brains the same way, right? This is what we were talking about earlier with how effective can you be at teaching. It's about how you explain things, but people receive things in a different way. There are general standards for better explanations, right? Like, you can use metaphors, and you can tell stories, and you can talk slower. And sometimes there's like a set of interests that are shared across, like, certain ages. So you're probably better off explaining things like within the context of Minecraft than within the context of, like, warfare for kids. But you're still going to be off by some degree. And so your variance of being off is going to increase the more children to teacher ratio there is. So 1-to-1 is better than 1-to-30, and 1-to-30 is better than 1-to-100, that sort of thing. But again, like, the whole edifice is built on the wrong first principles in general. Like, teachers are basically just like, information mediums, right? So really, we should be designing better information mediums than thinking about, student to teacher ratios.
That's an incredible point, actually. It's way deeper than most people actually think from at the surface level. Yeah.
Thanks. This is my job. I really care about this problem. So I don't know. Like I said, I'm motivated to try to get this right. So I hope that's the right explanation.
Yeah, for sure. So now, what do you think is the future of education, and people who are working on starting an educational startup, not necessarily edtech, but any education startup? What would you like to tell to them about these questions?
So it's a bit tied into what I just said, which is a good bridge. I think designing better information mediums is where we're heading. Like, the promise of something like an AI tutor in everyone's pocket is that an AI tutor replicates the information medium in a better way of like a one-to-one tutor, right? So it has more, like, way more data to call on. It can more easily implement best practices, for example, using metaphors, that sort of thing. And it's always there whenever you want it, right? It's also more, it's faster typically as well, right? So like information can be shared and you can adapt the explanation faster in something like an AI medium, assuming it works, right? We're not there yet. So most AI tutors are not better than human tutors. There are a couple exceptions to that, but I think that's a really good starting point. Beyond that, you start dealing with technological breakthroughs that need to happen, right? So at the moment, the best, highest bandwidth information interface that we have is the screen, which makes it really ironic that so many people are anti-screen, right?
Yeah.
This is like way higher bandwidth than a book, and people are freaking out about screen time for kids. It's like totally backwards. I get, by the way, like what I mean by that is that it's a software problem, not a hardware problem, right? There's nothing. Screens are inherently better at books, better at information conveyance than books, right? Because they can just like do way more from a bandwidth perspective. It's just that some software platforms have intentions that go against the best interests of their users, right? So YouTube's algorithm is designed for attention, not for information and the increased knowledge and that sort of thing. So anyway, short tangent on screens. Things like Neuralink and brain machine interfaces, I think, are probably going to be the next big thing. So you go from like physical books to screens like that are this big, to screens that are this big, to screens that are this big, to things that exist on your eyes, like the Oculus or Apple's thing, and eventually that's just going to go in your brain, right? Like that's kind of the arrow of progress, right? Is that computers are eventually just merging with humans, right? That is a very scary sounding future, and I'm not necessarily advocating for that future. That's a separate conversation, but I do think that's going to happen. Then at that point, like the brain, it's called a brain machine interface because you're basically sending data between those two things instantaneously without thumbs, right? So instead of tapping information onto a screen, you're communicating it in some way with the computer through your thoughts, and it can interpret that data appropriately. I don't know what exists beyond that. So I think that's the arrow that we're heading towards. I don't know if we'll get there in my lifetime. I kind of hope so.
Yeah, for sure. That's incredible. I think I have a lot of questions there. I don't think I have anything else to say. Anything you'd like to say?
No, this is great, man. I really enjoyed it. I think you asked some of the best questions I've ever been asked about this. So thank you for the opportunity to dive so deep on this stuff.
I'm glad. I'm very glad.